I survived for 100 cycles with 100 duplicants, and this video is the recap of what happened. The goal was basically to start right off the bat with 100 duplicants instead of gradually building up to that number. So if you think about it, the entire beginning would be absolutely chaotic because all the duplicants need to breathe and all of them need to eat, even though we have absolutely zero infrastructure. So the planning phase was absolutely crucial. I started by planning out the sizes of the rooms to the right, left, and down into the cellar in order to be able to set up the first rooms, such as bathrooms, bedrooms, a power room, and a water storage. After first unpausing the game, the oxygen was gone in an absolute instant. All the duplicants had to hold their breath, but geez, at least they were going to town in terms of digging. I then added a little bit of power as well as our first oxygen diffusers. The idea was basically to let the duplicants hold their breath and then just occasionally go over to the oxygen diffusers to catch it. Either way, on the left side, I decided to go for a bunch of toilets. And then on the right side, I would be having some bedrooms. After this initial moment, I kind of wanted to distribute the duplicant labor a little bit better, so it was time to dive into the duplicant priorities to adjust the one or other thing. The next task was to take care of the food issues, so at least 6 microbe mushers it would have to take. Just cooking up whatever the heck we can. Theoretically, we needed 100,000 kilocalories every day. Of course, in the beginning, we wouldn't be making that, but together with the muck roots that you can dig up, it was barely possible. By the way, guys, if you want to see the entire progress, there is a mini-series 25 parts on the entire process I went through to make this challenge possible. Of course, we also always had some issues with suffocating duplicants, trapped duplicants. It was just an absolute nightmare. 100 duplicants, a lot of them behave stupidly. I was then able to further distribute the power a little bit. Needed to be a little bit careful not to exceed the 1000 watts limit for the weak cable there. I also disabled the sinks because we were dependent on saving as much water as possible, and also I just needed the room bonus with as many outhouses as possible. Of course, I put the duplicants in various schedules in groups of 20 duplicants so that they would be using the infrastructure at different times. And of course, by now it was also time to dive into the research a little bit. I couldn't slack, I needed to make some progress, so we definitely needed to add more digging and building commands. I didn't want to leave the duplicants hanging. But yeah, we weren't even at the end of cycle 1 and I already had a huge infrastructure going on that usually would take me quite a few cycles to establish. I added more and more oxygen diffusers, so I had to track certain things. For instance, the Achi would be something that doesn't last for a very long time. And I already had some cables actually exceeding the 1000 watts limit, so I had to set up separate power systems in order to mitigate that problem. Next up, it was really important to already go ahead and establish our farms. So I tried to set up some rooms in order to take care of that. And furthermore, I went for a second row of microbe mushers. Right now, everyone was basically allowed to build the mush bars. And yeah, I intentionally say build because it is more of a building process than a cooking process. But you know, I wasn't complaining, at least my duplicants didn't starve. Next up, I also wanted a little mess hall for my duplicants. That was probably the most important room when it comes to morale bonuses. And so I kept on going, adding some more stuff to make it more convenient and maybe quick for the duplicants, with some ceiling lights and storages every now and then. I added more and more farms, but usually I just kept on trapping the dupes in some way or the other. And now, as of cycle 3, the starvation was starting to kick in. After 1 or 2 cycles, there was something odd I noticed. The dupes kept on disinfecting everything. It was an absolute waste of time. I also had to adapt in terms of what food I'm giving the duplicants, disallowing certain types so that I could cook them up, make them worthwhile, such as the meal lice in 2 lice loaf, giving us an extra 500 kilocalories for just an additional 50 kilograms of water. Then finally, my first skills were rolling in, but I soon realized we were lacking certain skills I was sure we would be getting for free in a colony of 100 duplicants. But for instance, we were lacking a mechatronics engineer and even advanced researchers and such. And then already in cycle 9, I had my first duplicant starving. Now, the rules of this playthrough were that I'm allowed to replenish the duplicants through the printing pod as soon as possible. I just had to take whatever duplicant is available in the first slot in order to replenish the number. So as soon as I only had one occasional death, then I would still be able to make the challenge. However, as it turned out, this would be spiraling out of control with the starvation, and eventually I would have to adapt my strategies. I kept on digging out terrain also for the muckroot that we would occasionally find inside the cracks. It was around this time I figured out there is actually a way to completely disallow disinfect, which I then did because I was just losing so much time, and this was also a crucial mistake of mine that a lot of the duplicants were spending their time disinfecting instead of doing something reasonable such as cooking or digging up terrain. I then added different farms such as the blossom seeds, and I also intended to add the mushrooms. I then added some infrastructure in order to get polluted water from the cellar upstairs and directly process it in order to replenish our water sources. I kept on adding more infrastructure, more mess halls, more farms, just attempted to overall expand whatever the heck we have going on, but I already feared it was gonna be too late. There were also more occurrences with duplicants getting trapped in sometimes precarious situations, and there was honestly now a huge issue with starvation. Up to 20 duplicants at a single time were starving, and of course if you have been watching the challenge through the series, you already know this would lead to our demise. We were clinging on desperately to each piece of food that we were able to get, still digging up the terrain, but yeah, essentially I had to micromanage every single bit in order to not allow all the duplicants to starve in one go. Right around cycle 20, I realized we would be running out of dirt sooner rather than later with all the outhouses and the meal lice that we had. So I started setting up a compost room. I was also able to start the mushroom farm and expand the bristle blossom farm, managed to get the starving duplicants right to around 10, which still was too many. And then it happened. We had our second duplicant starving. I was just not certain this challenge was even possible, but as it turns out, I just wasn't thinking big enough. Either way, I also was able to replenish this duplicant because the last death was far enough back to replenish him immediately, so I decided to keep on going. But then not even one entire cycle later, we had our third death. And I slowly lost the belief that I was capable of doing it, but still wanted to give it a chance. I didn't yet take care of an alternative oxygen system and my algae was running dry, so I had to set up desperate digging sites in order to get some more. It was stressful. I then discovered the somnium synthesizer, a very interesting machine, and we would be using that in order to boost our colony. I mean, this is the perfect playthrough to actually use this machine. But more to that in a second. Right after replenishing my last duplicant, we had Camille, another duplicant, dying. Very unfortunate. And I was also slowly running into temperature issues, thinking about how I could cool things down because the farms were just too close to the heat sources and therefore they would stop growing. So far, I intentionally didn't have enough oxygen production in order to save on resources, but I wanted to make the situation better with the occasional sublimation station. Also, it was about this time where I felt the need to start setting up a proper bathroom, which will then cut down on the amount of dirt we are actually utilizing. I was now forced to add an awful lot of algae distillers, but that didn't work either because I needed the slime for the mushrooms and I needed more plants overall, like 400 to support all the duplicants, and it was absolutely insane. I didn't even start to prepare the ranches yet, and inside, deep inside, I knew that this isn't gonna work out. We then had to deal with even more deaths. I only was at 99 dupes, so still able to replenish the numbers, but I felt like this was just the beginning of a huge wave, and I was right. At some point, I didn't even have the right atmosphere for the mushrooms to grow, and I also left the game running at a high speed, just to prove a point with 25 starving duplicants. Yeah, there was no sense in continuing. I would rather restart the challenge and utilize the knowledge that I gained from my first attempt, which is exactly what I did. Since I now knew what I was up for, I decided to plan things out a little bit better. First of all, I numbered all the duplicants to be able to easier find and distinguish them. I still divided them into 5 separate schedules with the maximum amount of downtime because I knew a trick how to avoid them actually performing the downtime. The next most important thing was to take care of the priorities. I wanted the duplicants to take care of specific tasks, and so I went through the list of tasks and started to disallow everything I only wanted specific duplicants to do. Now, it was all about finding the duplicants who were best at a specific task, such as 11 Builder, who also is featured in the last episode as the sole survivor on the second planetoid. Either way, I just identified all the duplicants with already established skills and talents and dedicated them to certain jobs. I also made sure to have enough cooks and to distribute all of the different roles into my various schedules. And with that out of the way, I was able to get the gameplay started. The first thing, of course, was still to dig up a little bit of terrain in order to establish the infrastructure. But this time around, I wasn't too worried about the layout anymore. I just wanted to leave enough space for each individual room, even if it is just 2 spaces high. The first room, of course, was taking care of the power because we needed to run a couple of oxygen diffusers right away. I also started adding a bathroom on the left side, just like we did in the beginning, but now on the top I added the bedrooms so they are closer to the toilets. This would allow the duplicants to more smoothly go through the first few slots of the downtime. I also prepared a water storage at the bottom, and the duplicants were just going absolutely insane in terms of building. I loved it. I added even more bedrooms on the top, but even by the end of the playthrough I would not have quite enough beds for everyone. On the right side, it was all about planning the farms as well as the great halls. I wanted to ensure to get the farms building as soon as possible this time around because I didn't want another duplicant to starve by cycle 10 or so. As soon as the first bathroom was already completed, I already added a second one. I definitely needed at least 2 of them so nobody would make a mess. And towards the right side, I just added a lot of farms right off the bat, as many as I think I was able to sustain. Of course, also doing more research, and everyone was helping with the farms, which made me really happy, but also anxious. The first crop, as usual, would be the meal lice. That was just the easiest to go for, and I planted them as soon as possible. And then, of course, we also couldn't miss the microbe musher. Very important. We needed to start producing food in humongous quantities. I then took myself the time to set up the Great Hall. This room technically wasn't necessary for the playthrough, but it did help out with morale boost. In order to not lag behind in this second attempt, I wanted to get started setting up the ranches right away, and I decided to go for 3 hatch ranches, as well as 2 additional ranches on the side. This of course wouldn't be enough for the entire colony, but it was all about a combination of food sources in order to sustain the colony for the 100 cycles. So there was quite a lot of building that I intended to do right now, but because we disabled disinfect in the beginning of the second attempt, it was actually much less of a pain. All the dupe labor went into the tasks that I actually wanted. Then 1 floor down, I decided to set up the first bristle blossom farm, and I also wanted to get this started, even though we were only at cycle 2. And even crazier, I already got started with a proper bathroom because I knew at some point I wanted to be able to make the switch to save the dirt. So I got the infrastructure already running, even though we wouldn't be using it for quite a few cycles. Then I wanted to set up a pumping system for my bristle blossoms as well as a pump to supply the rest of the base with the water. Since I dedicated cooking to only specific duplicants, I soon realized that we're gonna require way more cooks. I wanted to have my microbe mushers busy almost 24/7, and so I ended up with approximately 10 to 15 cooks in the end. Once I was done with the first bathroom, I already went ahead and set up the second bathroom 1 floor further down. At the very bottom, I decided to go for a whole bunch of grubroot plants, and so the only plants that I could already have and I was missing were the mushrooms, which of course I would be putting even further down for the carbon dioxide. In order to ensure better airflow, it was time to set up airflow tiles all over the base. It was important to distribute the oxygen as thin as possible to allow the extreme lag to be not as significant. I also needed to dig myself into sulfur deposits in order to be able to sustain the grubfruit plants. Of course, in the background, I kept on doing my exploration and research. That goes without saying. To make the bathroom functional, I added a water sieve with the intention to, in the future, automate it. This time around, I also gave everyone their skills as soon as they leveled up in order to maximize the potential. I couldn't give this playthrough even a little bit of slack. Also, it was time to get into the industry a bit more with a rock crusher. I wanted to replace certain cables and maybe combine the one or other power circuit. I ended up putting down even more micro mushers. I would then eventually switch to the cooking station, but I first needed my duplicants to level up and be able to use the cooking station, which around cycle 6 was actually possible. This time I also decided to go for all the plants that I could see in the immediate surrounding, and I also wanted to take advantage of the somnium synthesizer ASAP. I already had access to one rancher, so it was possible for me to get the hatches up, but I first had to progress far enough in the tech tree to be able to utilize the ranches properly. Still, already preparing it was key. I then added even more farms and decided to actually go with an airflow system to distribute the gases better inside the farms. Also, inside the consumables, it was always important to start managing that, and now I made the switch to electric grills. Of course, always keeping a bunch of micro mushers for the emergency mush bars that we needed to make. Then planting more bristle blossoms by cycle 8, I was quite happy about that, and so far I didn't have any starving duplicants. I then made my way downstairs in order to explore, maybe also get some more algae and other precious materials such as the gold amalgam. The next thing I wanted to do is already get prepared with a little bit of a system in order to distribute oxygen in the future. I just wanted to have this ready as soon as I made the switch to a electrolyzer system. By now I also got started with the mushroom farm. Some of them were growing, it was just a question of time until we can plant more. Even though at cycle 11 we were basically just getting started with the playthrough, it was time to plan out the SPOM, aka our self-powered oxygen maker, together with the electrolyzers. Obviously I used hydrogen generators to be able to power the system in the future, and since we wanted to make oxygen for at least 88 duplicants with this setup, I just needed a whole bunch of them. I then went ahead with the setup of the electrolyzers at the bottom, and then we just needed pumps, but it would be a huge contraption and of course still take a couple of cycles to introduce. I then proceeded to also set up the pumps. The system would be changing a couple of times throughout the planning phase, but essentially we ended up with approximately 18 pumps. It was then time for me to also think about a different food source, and of course one obvious one are the fish. So I tried to come up with a small fish tank design that would be breeding the fish for me automatically. I later realized that we don't have a mechatronics engineer, so all the automation was quite in vain, but at least we would already have it prepared for when we get our first mechatronics engineer. I got started with the automation, still not realizing that we cannot actually build it this way, so I'm just gonna skip this part because I ended up tearing it down again, just waiting for a mechatronics engineer, and by the time we established that, it was kind of too late. Also always funny observing the various duplicants doing their stuff. Like, I can't imagine sleeping well attached to a fire pole. The spawn was coming along nicely, except that a whole bunch of duplicants got themselves trapped, and I always had to micromanage them to get them out of suffocation mode. Right around here is where I realized it would take like 30 more cycles for me to reach a mechatronics engineer status. What you gonna do? Another thing I also already wanted to take care of was making my way into the steam vent. I already knew as soon as we activate this huge machine, we're gonna go through an entire pipe of water, well, at least at full capacity. However, we were actually making good progress when it comes to researching, so I was already getting into things such as smelting. By cycle 15, actually the game was running extremely smoothly. I had all my people doing something that actually makes sense. The only time waster, of course, I still had were all the duplicants trying to catch their breath. I was now interested in actually setting up the Dreamer schedule. I really wanted to take advantage of the somnium synthesizer, so I got that project started. Of course, we first had to make a couple of pajamas, and 20 supplier seems to be just watching other people work. I then decided for some weak duplicants to become my dreamers, made some more pajamas. My goal was to get started with 6 and see whether or not that is enough. Our hatch farms were now also starting to get full, so I was able to supply the other ranches as well and get started with the conversion process into stone hatches, which I can then just feed with igneous rock. It took a little bit to build the infrastructure of this bomb, and eventually I decided to just hook it all up to heavy watt wire instead of doing a complicated transformer setup. I also started filling up the fish tank with polluted water just with bottle emptiers, because I did have to do labor, no problem. I also set up a bunch of critter sensors to start automating the farms, but then again we needed the mechatronic engineers to do so. some more automation for this bomb, I would be playing around with these values for quite a bit, and eventually I decided to go with multiple sensors for areas of this bomb because it was such a huge contraption. As for the 2 additional ranches, I decided to go with Sweetle ranches using the additional space for grub-fruit plants. At this point I also had the desire to speed up the ranching a little bit, so I wanted to introduce incubators. I was now really running low on water already, so I had to tap into my additional resources in order to fill up my water storage. Then it was time to find a way to distribute all of the oxygen. I actually needed 9 full pipes just to be able to ship the quantity of oxygen I need to produce. And then I also had to find a way to keep the machines cool with a cooling loop going out from the hydrogen, so we never go above the 125 degrees I could. We ended up with a lot of spaghetti, but it actually worked out. The incubators started to do their thing. Right now I still had it on a manual switch, but eventually I would change it to a proper timer sensor. Together with my dreamers, I was now able to utilize the somnium synthesizer, so all I had to do is come up with a simple system to feed it the necessary oxygen. It's not like oxygen is already a problem in this base, but holy cow, the somnium synthesizer is absolutely worth it. There it is, now running and giving my dupes huge stat improvements. In the basement, I intentionally didn't set up any oxygen systems, I just utilized the polluted water, let it off gas, and I just took into consideration that some dupes might end up with yucky lungs. Then it was all about starting to distribute the oxygen, but I first wanted to cool it down to help keep the base cool overall, not additionally feeding it 70 degrees of oxygen. And there we go, we were now finally ready to get the system started. Of course, I sealed it off and already made a mistake, but that is just how it usually goes in oxygen not included. Either way, we were able to get things started. In the beginning, we would have some different gases, but overall the gases would be settling soon, and we could use this bomb to its fullest extent. By this time we went through enough research to actually have to take advantage of other research stations. We didn't end up using the virtual planetarium, but we ended up using the material study terminal quite a bit. Now I also wanted to replace the rest of the bathrooms, so all of the bathrooms were now ready to be utilized and we didn't waste any more dirt for outhouses. At the same time we were able to feed the thimble reeds that would allow us to make atmo suits, which I also didn't end up doing as it was not necessary for the challenge. Now I really needed to replenish my dirt, so it was time to set up the composts. I didn't have any more main projects on this planetoid, so I decided this would be the best moment to go for the second planetoid and see what we can find over there. I started by sending over 11 builder in order to be able to build and dig up everything, and this was actually the very last time this dupe saw the main planetoid. I made a quick and dirty bathroom and bedroom setup for this duplicant. He didn't need much comfort, he just needed to do his thing. Naturally, the first thing I wanted to do was gain access to the teleporters and activate them. I also made sure to go ahead and start collecting all of the polluted water. That was one of the resources that I wanted to save from this planetoid. In the meantime, on the main planetoid, the hydrogen was accumulating a little bit here in the top corner. Sleeping in hydrogen, I don't recommend it, so I tried to do something to prevent that from happening. Mostly my intention was just to release the oxygen, and then all of the other gases, they are supposed to land in the gas reservoir over there. There's also a little bit of extra hydrogen that we will be gaining, and I just want to lead that into a separate system that is supplying some of the power to our grid. This was also when I switched to cycle sensors for the incubators, but in the end I really wanted just a timer sensor that made more sense. I figured by this time it was crucial to get my metal refinery going so that I could keep on crafting the refined metals without losing too much of them. And obviously I also wanted to gain access to steel. Of course, I also always ran into issues with breathability. Sometimes a thin layer on top of polluted water would prevent it from off-gassing, almost killing all my duplicants. Also, my water storage really didn't look good. I needed to do something about it. Firstly, I just set up a pitcher pump in a different liquid where the temperature actually doesn't matter that much. And I finished the contraption for my metal refinery and the rock crusher. And there's the metal refinery in action. Basically, I'm just dumping the hot water on the top using the ice bomb to cool it down again and putting it back into the metal refinery. I wanted now to focus on the second planetoid a little bit. There were lots of interesting materials such as mud and polluted dirt that we could make use of. This also meant sending over yet another duplicant in order to help out on the main planetoid, mostly with shipping materials. By now I reached suit sustainability training with a lot of duplicants, so they became much faster. Lots of building commands always resulted in lots of trapped duplicants. I gotta say, 100 duplicants is definitely too many for one colony, definitely. On the second planetoid, I prepared everything in order to be able to ship the polluted water and normal water back to the main planetoid because we were not producing enough water to sustain the oxygen production right now. This was an absolutely crucial step and it would actually save our playthrough. I also wanted to prevent running dry on algae, so I got started with a bunch of algae distillers to process the large amounts of slime that we have going on. Also, by this time, my farms started to get a little bit too hot. And that was definitely something we had to prevent from happening. If I allowed this to continue, soon we would be struggling with food again. At least in the cooking department, my duplicants were doing a phenomenal job. To make the heat problem with my farms go away, I decided to just pump a little bit of cold brine through the farm in order to cool it down. So I prepared a little radiant pipe system there. By now, we were shipping over the polluted water from the second planetoid, and around that time I also activated the brine pump, getting the coolant through our meal ice farm. And we could actually see the effects right away. This was absolutely crucial, getting this below the 30 degrees mark again. With all the mud and polluted mud that I would be getting, it was time for some sludge presses. These were actually really helpful in filling up my water resources once again. Of course, this was extremely limited, but it would give a great boost while it was running. I then decided to send over yet another duplicant, so on the second planetoid they could be a little bit quicker and more efficient, I would say. Of course, we explored the second planetoid and did lots and lots of digging. I just wanted to figure out the locations of all the geysers and vents. By this time, I also wanted to introduce the automation for my ranches, so I didn't have to manually pick up the eggs anymore depending on how many critters I had in each ranch. I wanted this to go completely automatic. I also had to help out with extra sublimation stations and deodorizers in order to fill these nasty oxygen gaps inside the base. You know, I felt like going for the glass forge next. Some solar panels would have been nice. In order to do so, though, I had to take care of a system for the material study terminal in order to produce wrap bolts and start my research there. This cute little manual wrap bolt generation system would help me out in the beginning, but I also needed something different. And all that was really necessary was a rat bolt collector and a little Weezword nearby. I would go ahead and install a Weezword, and as soon as that is supplied with phosphorite, we would be producing some rat bolts on the side in order to fill up the material study terminal. There is now finally my promised timer sensor. As mentioned, that was the only thing that made sense. At this point, I felt sick of all the different power systems that I had going on, so I exchanged the entirety of the base with heavy watt wire in order to combine it all. I just wanted one big ugly circuit for everything that requires power. After this, I sent over yet another duplicant, number 73, to help out on the second planetoid. Next up, making the setup for the glass forge. You know, I didn't need much, just a bunch of pipes and a chute. And just like that, we were now beginning to craft glass for our solar panels. What a wonderful moment. Replacing all the cabling with heavy watt wire was not an easy task, especially because of the transition. We couldn't just hook it all up together. We first needed to have it built and then combine the circuits properly. Before reaching out to the top of the planetoid to expose space, I wanted to make a little liquid lock, or at least a lock that would trap the air a little bit better than just having it completely open. I also wanted this to function with oxygen masks, a very simple system so my duplicants could go ahead and breathe while building anything on the top. This of course also needed to be supplied with oxygen, which I think was fairly easy because by now our spawn was quite established. In due time, I was able to almost completely remove the normal wiring that I had going on, replacing it with the heavy one, and therefore for the first time we didn't have any more overloading issues. Everything was now going quite smoothly. I even started to get some idle duplicants, and I have to say, as of this point, I was able to run the game for longer periods of time before I had to intervene. Also, more sublimation stations were necessary. I knew this meant I would be going through my polluted dirt a little bit too quick, but at least my duplicants were more efficient because they didn't have to go as far to catch their breath. And the same thing counts for the seller. Installed some of the sublimation stations over there. Number 86 was responsible to place down the first solar panel, and this would help us out so much, just collecting all the juice during the day and then saving it in batteries for overnight. Even more sublimation stations. I only really had the oxygen to supply 80 or so duplicants with my system, maybe even fewer, because a lot of the time they would still hold their breath. By this time it was really only about micromanaging the base. Everything was running on its own. I only had to intervene when the duplicants did something stupid or whatever I hadn't automated yet. This was exactly the time when I decided it is about time to make a rocket program. I just want to figure out what I can find on the other planetoids, and also my slime, sulfur and dirt or polluted dirt were running low. I just had to know whether or not we can find an appropriate planetoid to replenish those resources. By now we were also shipping ethanol and a little bit of crude oil from the second planetoid, so I had to make filter systems that would dump the ethanol and crude oil towards the bottom while still shipping up the polluted water to where it needs to go. Got myself started with a little carbon dioxide rocket, nothing too fancy. I just needed to do some exploration. As it turned out, you first need to put down a telescope on the planetoid in order to explore the immediate surroundings, and this is gonna allow you to then continue with the shuttle. But yeah, basically we had an awful lot of carbon dioxide here at the bottom, so I just needed to pump it all the way up to my spaceship. I then went ahead and set up the rocket itself, just making sure we have a place to sleep and everything. It wasn't that important, the design, I just needed it to function without killing my duplicant. I then made my first attempt with the rocket to go out there, but this was before I realized I actually had to use the telescope to be able to get into the next tiles for space exploration. So said and done, I set up the telescope, and that's that. I also brought back my rocket in shame, and I was just hoping no other intelligent life is watching us right now. At this time I was slowly but surely running low on resources. Still, I wanted to gain access to some plastic and petroleum, so I just figured, why not make a simple and manual system to do so? Just a little bottle emptier and a pump. We would also need an oil refinery eventually, but I kept it very basic because we almost reached the end of the challenge. Of course, during the time, my dreamers were doing a phenomenal job creating the dream journals and boosting the entire colony. Oh yes, somnium synthesizer, just absolutely the best. And here is the system finally in use, the oil refinery creating some petroleum, and with the petroleum we're creating the plastic. Very nice. Not that we needed the plastic for survival, but it's still nice to have it. I also analyzed and activated the hydrogen vent here on the top. This was actually quite an easy power source because it would immediately cool down with it being in the ice biome, and I could directly just utilize the hydrogen for power. At this point, it was basically all about managing my resources. I kind of calculated it so that I would last the 100 cycles, and after that it would kind of break down. My slime was getting close to an end, and with the amount of sublimation stations we had, polluted dirt would also be going down dramatically. For some reason I was under the impression I still had the time to set up a geothermal plant, but that was kind of a waste of time, so I'm not gonna mention it again. I then finally discovered a new planetoid that I would be able to reach with my rocket. Unfortunately, it did not have any of the materials we desperately required, so that was kind of a disappointment. On the second planetoid, I was still hoping to find the sulfur geyser that would allow us to keep certain plants in place, but alas, it was just a little too late. I still decided to send my rocket over to the next planetoid in order to set up a rover module and still explore it a little bit. I also set up my first oil well just in case I needed a little bit more plastic, but it was more about not having anything else to do. On the plus side, my Pacu farm was running really well, and it was a huge contributor to our food supplies. By now, everything was running so smoothly and I completed all the projects that I could run through the last remaining cycles quite quickly, but it was clear that we still had to switch up a few things. I just couldn't supply certain farms any longer with the necessary resources. I also checked out the third planetoid, and as suspected, there was nothing there we could take advantage of immediately. One way I could solve this problem was just by uprooting all the plants that have been harvested recently and exchanged it with a plant that I have enough resources for, such as the meal lice. We easily had enough dirt to last for another 14 cycles, even if we totally went overboard with the meal lice. One immediate problem I noticed is that it is too hot for the meal lice, so I just dumped a little bit of cold brine on top of the farm task to cool them down in the short term. After a while, I replaced all the mushroom farms with meal lice as well as the grub fruit plants, and most of them were now at an appropriate temperature at cycle 95. I also made sure to build a farm on the second planetoid and to bring everyone back home except for one single duplicant 11 builder as mentioned in the beginning. There was now just one thing left to do, and that is finally automate the fish tank so that after cycle 100 I could just leave the game running and see whether or not we survive for a little while. But there we go, we did it! We survived 100 cycles with 100 duplicants, at least during the second attempt when learning about all the mistakes that I previously made. It still wasn't the smoothest attempt I could have done, and I really only managed my resources to last for 100 cycles, and this can be seen in the aftermath. After 100 cycles, everything starts to break down without my intervention, without me ensuring the survival of the plants, killing off the critters. There were just some things that still weren't sustainable. However, we made it through the challenge. Now this is the end of it. In cycle 106 I had my first duplicants dying, and then cycle 108 was the wave of death and starvation after most of my farms went too hot. But yeah, I would say with that out of the way, we're gonna wrap up this recap of the entire series. Of course, you can find the link in the description and the pinned comment in order to check out the entire series. It's well edited and very much worth watching in my opinion. But there you go. Thank you so much. Have a great time, and hopefully I'm gonna catch you in the next one. Bye bye.